A lot of the model for entrepreneurs have been driven by man's ego about like power and domination and, killer instinct and fast lane and so on. I think it's a big turn off for a lot of women out there. And we need a new model where business is a lot more systematic. It's a lot more about caring about the community. It's a lot more about serving users rather than just making money from them or increase LTV and stuff like that. The world is changing, and I hope somehow we can help this change to accelerate it.
Welcome to the Rise and Play podcast. I am Sophie Vaux, your host and leadership coach. In the show, my wonderful co-host and I sit down with influential and diverse leaders from the gaming industry to hear about their leadership journey. Not the well-polished stories, but the real stories. The up and down, the breakthrough, and the failures. Or should we rather say learnings? Each episode will transport you into a magical space of vulnerability with our guest. And together, you'll be reminded that no matter how hard it is, you are not alone in this journey and find the courage to keep going. Come and join the ride. Let's begin. Oh, and one last thing, I am working on new ideas to scale our impact on leadership health and consciousness in games. Would you like to be part of the change too? Then let's connect. Now, let's get to the episode. So hi, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Rise and Play podcast. And today I have a special guest, it's Ludovic Bodin. And before we get into the conversation, because I'm very excited to have Ludovic on the podcast today, I've read his book and then I started to learn more about his background and story. So for the ones who don't know Ludovic Bodin, I would say newer in the gaming industry, but known in other fields. He's a serial entrepreneur and investor with 3 exits and 2 unicorns. And Ludovic is the author of a book that I just mentioned, Atomic Scaling, How Small Teams Create Huge Growth. Quite familiar story for us in game teams, we lead game teams. The book covers a lot of insights from the gaming industry. So myself coming from the gaming industry, reading the book, it was very familiar, but applying those frameworks to other industry out of games. Beyond the book, Ludovic has worked also on a series of webinars, masterclass, accelerator, advisory services to support startup and scale-ups. So applying the framework. And the focus now is optimizing team performance, streamlining operations, and applying a marketing-driven growth strategy while leveraging AI and automation. And we'll get into that in detail for more of the juice and the beef of some insights from the book. But I welcome today, Ludovic, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's begin, because you are not like 80 years old. And when I read your bio with 3 exits and everything, you look quite young to me. We don't have to talk about the age, but you look quite young. So I'm very curious, how did you start your entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, sure. So I started my first company when I was 20 years old. That is 25 years ago. So I guess I'm 45 right now. And so the first company that I started was actually in France. I'm from France originally. It was local web and e-commerce related. I sold this company. And from there, I started living abroad and did more stuff. Yeah. I think at age 14, I got the first taste of business. And age 17, I remember trying to start a business during the summer, but I ended up not doing it. And age 19, I met Richard Branson, who is a flamboyant entrepreneur from UK. I actually met him in France at a competition around startup at Senna, so political event. And from that moment, well, I knew that it was time for me to, start my own company and live the Richard Branson life. So I was as much interested in his entrepreneurial success, but also his lifestyle, like, freedom and traveling and having this place in the Caribbean or Necker Island and so on.
How did you end up in the same room as Richard Branson? Was it a pure accident? And I understand that you got to talk to him and spend some time a bit with him, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So at that time, actually, so I'm 19 years old, I had a business mentor. His name is Bertrand Duchesneau, and he was actually the founder and the president of the business school that I was at that time. And I was basically helping him to run kind of accelerator for young entrepreneurs. And from that relationship, working with him, who was, quite famous in France and a pretty strong relationship internationally, I ended up being invited at the Tremplin ESSEC Senat. ESSEC is a business school in France, and the Senate is, well, their political institution. And at that event, I went to pitch basically Richard Branson about joining the accelerator. He listened to my pitch, couldn't come, but that was okay. And an exchange. And I ended up meeting him a few times later on when I was running my second company in China.
Wow. So you shared several events that happened in, I would say, quite a short amount of time, building the first business and selling it. I'm curious how you picked which business to start. How were you accompanied? What was maybe even the framework? And was that from the beginning the intention to sell it? So what was your thinking at the time in your 20s about business?
Yeah. So my first company when I was in my early 20s, basically I wanted to start a company. And at that time, I didn't really have special vision about the type of company and so on. And actually, as part of the accelerator that I was running with my mentor was a co-founder. Her name was Magali. And she was a tech co-founder working with her husband actually on the project. She was not just ready, was first-time entrepreneur, more tech type of background. And I basically decided that it was time for me to start the company. And I co-founded the company with her and sold it pretty quickly. So that was in my early 20s. From there, I went abroad. That's actually probably the main motivation for me to have sold the company back then. A lot of my friends were starting to travel around the world. I was like, okay, this is cool to run a tech startup in Brittany, in France, but I can probably do more than that. So I went to live in Canada. I did my master degree in Waterloo in Ontario. From there, I knew like I was still very thirsty for more travel. So I went to work and live in Latin America for 3 years. I work in investment and modernization of telco companies, first in El Salvador, and then in Mexico, in Colombia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and so on. And then after 3 years or so of that journey, I knew that I wanted to go back to entrepreneurship. I was, living the expat life, working for a big group at that time. So I wanted to go back to entrepreneurship. And actually, around the same time, Richard Branson actually mentioned that, entrepreneur of my age should go to China because, that's where the opportunity and so on. So it really echoed in my mind. I was already into the Chinese culture. I was practicing Chinese Kung Fu while I was living in El Salvador with a Taiwanese teacher. And
Wow.
So from there, I bought my ticket. I went to live in China with the idea to start up a new company. And I had a business coach, Bob O'Bray, who was American from California, like early Apple employees. And he helped me to kind of, figuring out the blueprint for me to be on this new journey, both personally in the new culture in China and professionally starting a new company. Very quickly, I had the opportunity to invest in a new airline company. Don't ask how or why, but that's happened sometimes. I was 21 or something like that at the time. So no, 24 at the time. And this new airline company was in Macau. I was breaking the monopoly of Air Macau.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to Macau to start working on this investment. Very quickly, I realized it was quite far away from my core expertise. Starting a new airline is not easy. But I ended up starting up a new company, which was online travel, that became Macau.com, who actually work with also the new airline that ended up being built up and, first plane being bought from Google. One of the difficulty of airline is actually to find planes to be able to acquire. There's not many to buy. Mm-hmm. And Macau.com, so it was online travel and e-commerce. I sold the company. And from there, I went to start up many new companies, a venture studio, but at that time, the word didn't really exist. And I ended up starting 3 companies, one of them being CMUNE, so the video game company that I spent, quite a bit of time on, around 10 years on. And my co-founder on CMUNE was actually my CTO on Macau.com, was also one of my best friends when I arrived in China. So I didn't really have any specific interest about gaming versus online travel or e-commerce or or online real estate or online healthcare or whatever. But I had a special interest in the relationship with my co-founder, and also like, working together on a new company, this time as co-founders.
So that made me relate to one of the concepts you mentioned in the book, and have been mentioned also by several entrepreneurs, the famous magical pair. And do I understand correctly that you have built most, or at least multiple companies with the same co-founder partner?
Only this time. So his name is Sean, and Sean, he was actually hired as a consultant for 1 week in Macau. He ended up staying there for a very long time while actually was living in Korea. So he literally moved everything originally for a week, and he ended up staying in Macau for quite a while, working as basically the CTO on Macau.com. And then we started CMUNE together. And then I actually invested in 2 of his companies later on. Yeah. But CMUNE, that was my video game company. We had a flagship title called Uberstrike. Actually, we didn't start as a gaming company. We started as a participatory platform, which was, very much living in the future of like total world and stuff like that. But we gradually pivot to gaming. My business coach, Bob O'Bray, was also the business coach of Nicolas Gaume back in the day, who was the founder of Callisto, one of the top success in the 90s. And Bob was actually involved also in that. So when I pivoted to gaming, somehow Bob also encouraged me to do that, and actually mentioned that we're clearly like a magical pair, Sean and I, building up maybe the next, Electronic Arts or Disney or Pixar or whatever. We grew a game pretty much organically. Like, it was originally an experimentation, kind of a weekend project. But this weekend project ended up being a week later top in the chart of the Mac App Store, which was, before iPhone and so on. And within 2 weeks, we were number 1 worldwide, which we remained for, 2 or 3 years or so, number 1 worldwide on the Mac App Store. And from there, we evolved with, the rise of social media. So we received prize from Chris DeWolf, actually, MySpace back in the day, as a best game on MySpace. And very quickly we went to Facebook, and we grew the game to about 30 million players and 2 million fans, which at that time on Facebook was multiple times more than League of Legends or Counter-Strike or whatever for the fan page on Facebook. So that became the largest brother multiplayer games made with Unity. We started working with Unity 3D when my partner was actually in Korea. He was working with Joachim on actually one of the first MMO build up on Unity. And then we built up Uberstrike. I think when we started working with Unity, there were like, 5 to 7 people maybe.
Wow. And in China at the time, where were you living?
When we started up CMUNE, my partner was actually back in Korea because, I kind of took him from Korea to Macau, but he really wanted to actually experience Korea. We actually met originally in China. We actually learned Chinese together at the same Chinese school, which happens to be kind of a Korean school, but to learn Chinese in Beijing. And from there, when I pivot from, startup studio to actually fully commit on CMUNE, gradually we spend more and more time physically together, and it made more sense at that time to be in China. So the first real studio actually for CMUNE was actually in Korea, then Beijing, and then we had multiple studio in Asia, like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and my partner also spent some time in Unity with a few of our guys. Yeah.
Wow. And also I see here in the timeline where maybe the first 2 business and the way you describe them have been quite quick, in the world of building, growing, selling. And then the game company, 10 years it's a substantial amount of time. Lining up those different businesses, you mentioned as a start, you just wanted to build a business, period. I'm sure that motivation has evolved over time, and I'm curious to hear what was the driver for you, or the result you wanted from the multiple companies you created after the first one you sold?
Yeah, I think the first one, I really wanted to, be the entrepreneur. I mean, I was ready for it. I wanted to do it. And from there, like, I knew that I wanted to have a little bit more international exposure. So that's kind of the drive to actually sell my first company. Macau also, I wanted to go, same thing, I wanted to go beyond Macau. Macau.com was very much dedicated to be kind of the clearinghouse for Macau, like reselling tickets and hotels, rooms and flight tickets and shows, Cirque du Soleil and so on and so on. So I wanted to be more like kind of the, Silicon Valley type of startup. At that time, China was also rising, so it was very interesting. Gaming also was rising, and a lot of that was actually driven from Korea and China, the free-to-play model and so on. So we felt we actually had some edge being in Asia for that, but really the distribution was in USA for us. I think at that time, I wanted to be a billionaire. That's like the things in my mind, like the young entrepreneur, tech, Silicon Valley, like, okay, I want to be a billionaire kind of stuff. And a lot of the guys that I was surrounded with were into this journey of, going for it, like the unicorn and the billionaire life and so on. It was clearly a long sprint on CMUNE. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to actually make the shift to investment. And from there, I basically went full on investment. I started investing, and within 3 years, actually less than 3 years, I had 2 unicorns that I invested. One was in sport and blockchain, actually, a company called Chili's, and I was first investor on the board. I sold around that $1.4, $1.5 billion. And the second one is ASIG, which is in a company in Singapore, live streaming and e-commerce. And then I had many other companies that I invested, which pretty much all of them did a follow investment. One of them you mentioned before is from Joseph Kim in gaming, Lila Games, that's later on also raised from Sequoia Capital. Investment in longevity in New York, investment in fintech, algo trading, actually 2 of them. It's actually one field that I'm also particularly interested. A very small team and kind of, huge growth because everything is pretty much automated. You don't have a lot of intermediaries and so on. Fractional ownership, that's actually one of Sean's, my former business partner, a new company, and real estate tech, new car company, AI platform, e-commerce, etc., etc.
So before we get into your investment journey, which is built on a thesis that is also related to the book, I wanted to ask more of a personal question here, because that's I put here my lens as a coach, where we working with founders is getting into the journey of how they started something, why, and then the why is updating along the journey, right? So with that billionaire goal, I assume you reached the goal. What now? What was that moment where, okay, I reached the finish line. What now? What happened for you at that moment?
No, I didn't reach the goal. Being an investor, but it doesn't matter. It's not the goal anymore. Being an investor in Unicorn doesn't make you a billionaire yourself, except if you have, 50 or 60% share. But this actually is maybe the agitation of a young man. But actually, as I grew up, and probably in my 30s, or probably late 30s, actually, I realized that it is actually not the $1 billion from Richard Branson that I was actually attracted to, but more actually his lifestyle and more the freedom to travel around the world, meet a lot of cool people, have some impact in many industry, but also many people that you work with. So, freedom and impact actually suddenly become the new definition of being a billionaire for me, not the $1 billion in the bank account. In my journey, I met many, many billionaires, including from the gaming industry. None of them are like fundamentally happier today than they were when they were not a billionaire. You don't need billions of dollars to feel free and travel the world, and you don't need to start to have $1 billion to start to have an impact on people's life. At that time, the model, like you make $1 billion as quickly as possible, and then you do philanthropy. Well, as I grew up, I realized like the chance of being a billionaire is actually a little bit the same as a lottery ticket anyway. And the waiting to be old to start to have an impact on society is maybe a little bit an outdated model.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks for sharing in such a genuine way. We update ourselves through the journey and what we chase. We realize what was behind that we chase. And I think like here, I do see and relate to freedom, which is what you have as an entrepreneur by default, and impact as you become big. And there are so many ways of doing it. And I see totally when you talk about freedom, impact, how much you're doing this in all of the actions that you have shared so far.
Maybe to come back on the freedom part, because the freedom of being an entrepreneur is actually true and not true. Many entrepreneurs actually feel trapped in their own business. And many entrepreneurs feel like you have to work harder and it's going to get easier later on, but actually it doesn't get easier later on. It's as hard as at the beginning. It's just different mountains that you have to climb. And so atomic scaling for me, also the way we built up atomic scaling as a business, but also the way we help entrepreneurs to build up their own business is very much to also provide freedom for me, but also freedom for the entrepreneur that I work with. It's actually more about building up a system where actually entrepreneurs are actually less and less important for the business, that the business depends less and less on the entrepreneur because the system is actually, running by itself. And that's where we focus a lot on system, AI, automation, empowering the team. And it doesn't mean that the team should be locked neither to the business. Like you also want to make sure that the people who actually build the business with you also have the capability to enjoy freedom as the business grow.
Yeah. That speaks a lot to me, where that was one of my motivation of moving away from employment to go to entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And in that definition, freedom, it's more of a freedom of time. You know how to use the time. And in the world we live, especially coming from games where there are things that you can automate so much that the business is working for you while you're not actively working on it, right? So that's the beauty of it. Yeah. I related a lot to the concept of the book. So let's get into the book here. So it seems like you've been busy doing a lot of things. And when did that happen, that process of writing a book? Because I know as well, having interviewed several writers and entrepreneurs, it is a lot of work. So when did that happen? What was the process when it was published? I think this year, yeah.
Yeah. The origin story actually of the book happened, years before actually I started working on the book. I was a gaming entrepreneur. I was basically our development team were in Asia. Our business partner, investors, and so on were in Silicon Valley. So I was back and forth, Asia, Silicon Valley, Asia, Silicon Valley, and I was literally hiring on one side and fundraising on the other. Hiring on one side, fundraising on the other. And it was never enough. Basically, the more people I hire, the more I need to fundraise. And it's kind of this infernal loop. And as I was in between Asia and California, I had a stopover in Finland. And we actually, at that time, shared the same investor with Supercell, Tomiko, the founder of Skype, Niklas Lindström. I decided to actually do the stopover in Helsinki, meet Ilkka Pananen, the founder of Supercell, for breakfast. At that time, the company was still very small. We're in January. They literally launched their first mobile game maybe 6 months ago with Clash of Clans. And I didn't know much Ilkka, and Supercell was not that famous at all at that time. And I start sharing entrepreneur to entrepreneur what I was feeling to Ilkka. So I start to explain to him that, I'm basically constantly hiring, constantly fundraising, and that will be okay. But it was not, because actually the more people I hire and the less productive I feel the team is. And Ilkka very calmly say, why don't you stop hiring and focus more on your existing team? And in my mind, I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I've got 25 people on one game. At least I need another 40 to 60 people to hire. And then Ilkka come back and say again, why don't you stop hiring and focus more on your existing team? And then he started to show me his t-shirt with, the black t-shirt with the Supercell white logo on it. And he started to explain to me that at Supercell, they develop games with usually a team of 5 to 7 people. And actually the name Supercell come from this idea that you need to keep the team as small as possible for as long as possible. And then really treat your team as like a Formula One team, and make it super, get this exponential growth while keeping the team as small as possible. And then things starts to click. I come back to Asia and I'm like, okay, let's do the Supercell way. And, everyone in the company is like, yeah, sure. But can we hire another 40 guys because we have all these features, and can you go and fundraise more money because blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, but we need to do the Supercell way. You keep the team. And, I kind of push this idea and people start to get into it. But really, maybe we managed to keep the team like smaller and have multiple small teams and so on. But we didn't really get this exponential growth. As I go to investment and I start to basically invest full time, I start basically to realize that I should put my investment principle on paper. And as I'm thinking that, boom, COVID happened. Mm-hmm. As COVID happened, I'm literally like, whoa, the world is going to change dramatically. And I'm not thinking virus and this and that. I'm thinking the world is going to go online very, very fast. And once people taste it, they will not go back to it. A little bit like the Matrix kind of stuff. And from there, I start to go into more like a inner journey, and I realized like, cool, that means for my investments, gaming, e-commerce, etc., things are going to be even more wonderful. But for the rest of the world, the people who are not that digital, it's going to be tough for them. And we're going to see, big divide happening. So basically from there, I start writing Atomic Scaling, and that's really how it started for me. So beginning of COVID, with the idea that on one side, it will be my investment principle, the kind of company that I'm naturally attracted to. But on the other side, I also want to share with the world all these lessons we learned in gaming, which happens to be, as you say, almost 100% online. So all these lessons for companies that are more or less 100% online, how this lesson can apply to other industries. Other industries, some of them being digital native, like edtech and fintech and so on, but also like more traditional company who need to maybe pivot to be more online. Mm. And the process of writing, you're very right. It takes a while. So I start writing literally the first 3 manuscripts. I write it on my own with a group of writers, business writer on one side and gaming executive founders and so on the other. So every time I will have a manuscript that I'm like, wow, this one is the right one, I will share it with the group. People will give me feedback, usually good job, try again. And after 2, 3 and so on, I'm like, tough. I hired a business coach, a writing coach, Brian Tracy, and, they really give me a boost. I start to have the proper tools to actually write a book. So it's not, Google Doc anymore. It's like, Scrivener, which is like a tool for writer. I start to listen to the right music. I start to block times to write, at least X hours a day, usually 3-4 hours a day, nonstop. Like you cannot leave until you finish whatever words per day and so on. And I'm like, it's happening. It's going to be amazing, but it's still not. But it's getting better. And then I have one of my other coach, Christine Comerford, who actually introduced me an editor, Amanda. And she said, okay, all the book that I wrote, I literally wrote with her. She's amazing. You should work with her. Let me introduce her to you and, work with her. A week later, we were working together, and that, became pretty much manuscript 6 or so. Then publisher with in Austin, Texas. And by then, most of the job on the writing part was done. And then the publishing start, which, took also quite a while. Ultimately, we launched the book on March 14th on stage at GDC in San Francisco, at the Game Developer Conference in San Francisco. It was a very special moment, as I was also sharing the stage with one of my former employees who is now at Google, Neil. So it was like a very cool moment. And then we had a book launch party that was in San Francisco, hosted by Yodo One. James actually Lalonde was also one of the writer and gaming executive who was giving me feedback on the first few manuscripts. And then the book became a bestseller on Amazon.
Wow. That is an entrepreneurial story in itself. What a persistence, like manuscript 7. That's important to share because there's always the myth, the dream of a writer. I don't think writers share so much about the hurdles that happened before they could publish, right? So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, and it's a team effort and a lot of magical pair involved in between, from James and Frederick and so on early in the journey. And then my editor, clearly like a magical pair with me. And then the publisher that also involved many people who within the publishing company who help you to go through the publishing journey.
Yeah, but I respect it a lot, the process of writing. And, as we as consumer, we pay the very low price of, of that work. Of course, at scale makes sense, but, it makes you appreciate also knowing the amount of work for writers. It is a very difficult job, that I have learned that. And I'm very, admirative, just like publishing a book. And when it's good as well, like that must have been a lot of work. And you are just confirming to me the number of iteration. Congratulations on the launch. I think this is also a story worth appreciating with the book itself, always the background story. As we're addressing the book and also being mindful of the time for our conversation today, so much you ask, I will have to, follow up on a lot of things we discussed today. I'd like to touch on some concepts and topics from the book. So I've read it, and coming from games, there were things that were very familiar, but for the listeners here who haven't read the book, we will share some key points. And of course, if you want to know everything, you have to read the book. But at least for today, a snippet or executive summary of some parts. So let's start maybe with the basis of what was the book and principles you approached, and who is it for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is for tech entrepreneurs, including gaming entrepreneurs, but also entrepreneurs and executives who are not necessarily in tech or in gaming and want to learn the lessons learned from the gaming industry, which is 100% online. From the kind of company or entrepreneurs that we work with beyond the book, the atomic scaling, we see it as a navigation system, a little bit like a GPS or like a Google map, if you want. So you are on a journey to go from point A to point B, whatever the size of the mountain, to go from maybe 1 million to 10 million in revenue, annual revenue, or from 10 million to 100 million annual revenue. Like at the end of the day, it's a different mountain, but the journey somehow is the same. The navigation system principles are the same. And specifically for atomic scaling, there is two parts within this navigation system. There is what we call like the business operating system, which is very much around team alignment. So team alignment for the kind of people we want to have in the company, and make sure that, everyone aligned in terms of like values and the way we're going to work, the fact that we're an atomic scaler type of company. That means we're going to stay as small as possible for as long as possible. It's not like the traditional Blitz scaling model where you're going to hire a lot of people every time you have a problem. Okay, just hire one more person that will solve the problem. That's not how we work. We're actually very focused on keeping the team as small as possible for as long as possible and solve repetitive things with AI and automation. We also very focused on prediction. So the first part is people, the second part is prediction. Having this data-driven approach, which is well familiar in the gaming industry, but maybe not as familiar in other industry, the importance of benchmark. We have things like Apani and so on to give us a lot of benchmark in the gaming industry, but other industry is not as transparent. So how do you actually get to this sort of depth in the benchmark when you actually build up your assumption as you're building up your system? And then we talk about playbook. Playbook in our case is not SOP. It's not like standard operating procedure on how to do things, but actually why we are doing what we are doing and who we want to serve. You talk a lot about alignment also about your cause. And I think it's something that I realized over the years as I created more companies, but also invest in a lot more companies, the importance of being aligned with who you're serving in terms of the cause, in terms of who they are. Do you already have access to them? So that's very much like the business operating system. So what we call the 3P. So people, prediction, and playbook. And the second part of the navigation system, which will be quite familiar with the people in game industry, is actually the sales and marketing approach. So the sales and marketing like product funnel. So it's about reach, how you acquire traffic, how you acquire users. It's about revenue. We have a pretty strong focus on a freemium model, which we believe is still the best model for online. And then retention with a lot of focus on live ops also.
It is such a complex model, but that's what you do with a book to make it accessible with a framework and the name. And that's something I appreciated a lot with the book. The 3P.
Reach, retention, and revenue.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So this is for the ones who will get into the book. There's a lot of acronyms. It's helpful to actually remember. And I wanted to mention some of the parts that for me, coming from games, that although it was familiar, but because it's written from not just coming from games, I found it was a good reminder. And especially as maybe some game founders are considering venturing out of games, it is actually important to translate the things we know from games in other industry. And for example, the prediction, it's so funny because we work with a system that is like the default state for us. And then myself venturing out of games, I forgot all the playbook. And then it's like, how do I predict this? How do I know how much it costs to acquire? And then all the percentage of the whole funnel conversion. And when I'm not having it, it's like, why did I not focus on it? So it was a good reminder for me to just like zoom out, understand what is the model we use. And I would say in business, it's so important to know your number, your math for the economic unit. And we tend to forget that in business, like basic.
We created a common language. Like if you want to be able to, play the same game, you need to have common language, understand the same rules, like, what it's going to take. So for example, like when we talk about prediction, we're also very focused on what we call a BPM, like a business process mapping. So you start to actually draw the whole funnel, the different action and the conversion rate that you expect and so on. A lot of companies actually are not doing that. Like, the conversion rate from one email to another, or the activation rate. Like, to give you maybe a few use cases of the company that we work with, like we work with like tech startup, like $1 to $10 million in revenue. We literally train the whole management. At that stage, we're very focused on go-to-market and team alignment. The importance of team alignment with a playbook, understanding, why they're doing what they're doing, the origin story, who they are serving. Like that's usually quite difficult for startups to still express properly. Map out their system, included on how they can automate and the kind of numbers they can expect from it. Start doing paid advertising and a lot more. The rhythm also is super important. Tech startup, they're like, we ship when we ship kind of stuff. Not really. Like you actually want to build up this regular rhythm, this regular cadence in terms of, like, for example, your weekly scorecard. So you actually check the key metrics on a weekly basis and you basically compare with your hypothesis, with your benchmark. The monthly review to actually see, how you're doing. And we work on a quarterly basis. So we don't really go beyond a quarter. We have like 36 months kind of visions, which we also like quantify, but the real work is based on a quarterly basis. So from there, you have a lot of things that derivate, including the frequency of release, the frequency of update, the frequency of upgrade, etc., which we kind of know in gaming. How often you should update your game, how often you should actually upgrade and resubmit to the App Store and so on. But a lot of that is actually maybe unknown outside of gaming.
Yeah. It made me just realize when you take the system out of the environment, it is not that straightforward to translate it. So that's why it needs a bit of a translator. That's how I see the value, even from game people, to translate the framework, because it is operating in a very existing system. So we are not doing anything. We're just using the system, the store, and the framework is already there for companies. So for me, it was very helpful to zoom out on the whole loop of prediction and looking at your numbers and applying in different use cases. And one point I wanted to touch on, there are so many things we can cover on the book, but I'm not sure we will have the time. But that really marked me because as I'm also accompanying a lot of studios, founders, early stage, a lot of times I hear, I want to build my studio, my game, the game that I wish I could play and so on. And this could be a motivation back to, the why of building a company, but it's very difficult to justify a VC-backed studio, for example, or you even have a market? And there was a part, that quote of that millionaire, millionaire MG DeMarco, and I read his book after as well out of curiosity. But I really liked it because he was so blunt. The world doesn't throw $1 billion at a person because the person wants it or works so hard they feel they deserve it. The world doesn't care about what you want or deserve, but it's about creating something that 1 billion people would want. And that was for me such a great reminder that we have, of course, selfish needs to start a business, but a business has to start with needs from users and consumers. So that part was a very good reminder, I found.
Yeah, it's actually something as a younger entrepreneur, and also in many young entrepreneurs that I meet today, more on the investment side, that I didn't understand. Like I thought, if you work really hard, like you will actually do it, and you will be, if you really want it, and if you work really hard, well, but that actually doesn't really work like that. Yeah. So shifting away from what you want, which for example, $1 billion, and being a lot more interested and curious about how the world want and how you can serve that, which we have also a model for that in atomic scaling related to playbook that we call the BRO framework.
Yeah. So as we touch on here on some concepts and you explained from the beginning the multiple parts, I really invite the listeners to anyway check the book. I recommend after reading it, so it's not like out of nowhere. And also you have a lot of materials online with webinar and masterclass to go a bit further, and it's a bit more accompanied with the steps you described just earlier. I'd like to close the conversation today with a bit of a zoom out as we went through your career. And for me, this is more of the part that I call, of course, you're not retired, so the lessons and learning are always in the making. But at this step of a journey for you, because I see, of course, a certain path where as a young, you cared about maybe selfishness. I want to be an entrepreneur, and then I want to be a billionaire. But what's important for you today with all those lessons? Because you have freedom, traveling, impact. What drives your decisions today with all those learnings?
Yeah, as you said, in my 20s, I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I also wanted to broaden my horizon. So that's where I started going international. In my 30s, I was very focused on building and scaling, but I actually at that time I think I didn't have enough perspective on what it takes. The kind of game you play, the kind of team you actually build up. I was for a long time into this Blitz scaling model. So I thought like you have a problem, just hire more people, they will solve the problem kind of stuff. I didn't understand yet the atomic scaling part of it. And then the importance also of having one or multiple coaches. Actually, in my journey, there were always a coach behind me who actually helped me to kind of go to the next step, being part of masterminds also. Today, it's a lot more freedom and impact. So freedom for me, but also freedom for the entrepreneur that we work with. We're a lot more like a system oriented, a little bit like a game, actually. Your company should be like a system that runs online 24/7, that should sell where you sleep. That's how we see it. We see it a lot more like a marathon rather than a sprint. A lot less about hustling, hustle, and you will make it. Like kind of the very man type of attitude. I think it's actually the wrong attitude today. This killer kind of instinct, like, I'm going to make it, like I'm going to sell these things and so on. And that's not the approach that I encourage people to have right now. Balancing all this also with more like a personal, including, family and stuff like that. So part of my motivation is to provide more freedom to more people, including women actually around the world in their executive or entrepreneurial journey.
Mm. We haven't met for a long time, but we've connected around the book, and I'm very appreciative of the discussions, the collaboration, even like in this one today that we've done. And I've been very moved by that part of the course for you. Before we started off the record, a part where you mentioned about the future you wanted to create as an entrepreneur for your daughters, for them to grow in a world where they could be entrepreneur and not believe that it's something that you have to really work and break several ceilings. That really touched me, and I'm so grateful that you are part of the supporters in building this world, because we do have an impact and you are creating that impact. And I asked that question at last: where do you get the most joy these days in all the things you do? You have a lot of things, but where do you get the most joy?
Before getting there, I think one thing also important to remind to people is that we talk about the magical pair in business. But I think it's important to also remind the entrepreneur out there that the first magical pair is actually the magical pair that they have in their personal life. So being their wife or their husband. I think in my 30s, clearly I will not have able to go through all these ups and downs, without the love of my wife and daughters, no matter what, like being there for you. In terms of the future, you mentioned it, like I see a world where it's actually time for women to rise in the universe, I think we're at the pivotal shift right now. I think of it, I mentioned the reverse pyramid in the book, but more about the boss actually having less power in a company. But I also think in a much broad way, there is a reverse pyramid happening right now, where actually the woman actually should lead and the man should actually support them. Specifically in gaming, I think we should not just encourage women to help other women to rise, but also have every man in the executive position or founder role and so on, to also deliberately make the effort to provide support, opportunities, and resource for women to blossom in their career. I actually particularly enjoy working with a women entrepreneur. One of the company that we work with, it's a retail company. It's in Southeast Asia, a very big retail company. They've been challenged by the rise of the Alibaba and Amazon of the world and so on, but they were still dominating. And then when COVID happened, boom, they went from $1 billion in revenue offline to $0 in revenue. And Tina, the CEO, who actually has been, literally was the first job after university to join the company, and now she's the CEO of the company. That's a family-owned business. Literally had to make this. And so we went to train the whole executive team. A lot of them actually were women. From there, they actually rise. One of the young lady actually in the group became the CEO of a new joint venture that was created specifically to serve online. And that's like, it's very, very pleasant to see that happening. We talk about the world being a little bit dry. I think it's maybe dry because too many men in the room. And the gaming industry will be, again, vibrant and abundant if we could have more women rising into executive and also a founding role. And that applies to gaming, but I think for pretty much any other industry. I realized that maybe after, but the fact that a lot of the model for entrepreneurs have been, driven by men's ego about like power and domination and, killer instinct and fast lane and so on. I think it's a big turn off for a lot of women out there. And we need a new model where business is a lot more systematic. It's a lot more about caring about the community. It's a lot more about serving users rather than just making money from them or increase LTV and stuff like that. The world is changing, and I hope somehow we can help this change to accelerate it.
That's beautiful words and sharing thoughts. Thanks a lot for that. I feel very inspired. And this is like the work you're doing right now, just by sharing those words, those thoughts, those aspiration, that you're already supporting women and the listeners, because we have many women in the audience. And for women listening as well, let's be part of that movement, because we are all like living in the same world and there's abundance, more to share than to take. So I fully see that. And I'm very grateful for entrepreneurs like you who think that way. And I truly believe as well, you're not the only one. And more will also come out, as you also are very open about it. So finishing on that note, thank you so much for, your learning, your wisdom, and just the genuine stories. I loved it. And I would love to continue the conversation in some way, another episode or offline dinner. Thank you so much. It was a delight, a pleasure.
Thanks again for having me, Sophie, and thanks for all the work you're doing.
Thank you.